Welcome everyone. This is Pospo and BRAINCAST for Mostly Learning. 5 days post-lockdown number 2, and with a new president for the United States. To be honest, if there was just half of the enthusiasm and interest about local elections as the one we've seen worldwide about American elections, the world would have been a better place. To be honest, the world is indeed a strange place, but the good news is we got rid of the second most annoying thing this year. By Donald. Last week, we tried to make the world a better and safer place for our patients as we welcomed one of the co-authors of the Maudsley Practice Guidelines for Physical Health Conditions in Psychiatry, Dr. Toby Pillinger. This week, we go back to our roots as we shift our focus back to undeniably the first most annoying thing, our old friend COVID, a virus that seemingly had nothing to do with the brain, but as time went by, it proved to be otherwise. Our today's guest sits on the executive committee of the Faculty of Neuropsychiatry of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the British Neuropsychiatric Association, and the Council of the Fellowship of Postgraduate Medicine. He's director of the MSc in Clinical Neuropsychiatry here at the IOPPN and leads the largest international project on functional neurological disorders with over, wait for that, 40 multidisciplinary experts from 14 countries. What brings him here, though, today is his long-standing interest in the biological causes of psychiatric symptoms and recent focus in the full spectrum of neuropsychiatric symptoms resulting from COVID-19. BRAINCAST people, this is Dr. Tim Nicholson. Tim, welcome to BRAINCAST.
Hi, Pospo. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and great job you're doing with these webinars. They're fantastic.
So, Tim, let's start with the basics. Although SARS-CoV-2 is primarily a respiratory virus, it seems that it can wear many hats and indeed have implications a bit further north from the lungs, in our brains. Moriguchi described a case where viral RNA was detected in the CSF of an encephalitis patient, while in another paper reported the presence of the virus in the cytoplasm of the frontal lobe neurons. So how does it do that?
Well, the brain effects of COVID are still something we poorly understand. Thankfully, it's become increasingly recognized that it is a potential problem, both clinically, and we're trying to get to the bottom of the mechanisms for this. As you mentioned, there's been some mixed studies about the actual direct invasion of the virus into the brain. And this was, the expectations this might be the case on the basis of SARS and MERS, so the other severe coronaviruses that predated COVID-19. So although there's good in vitro evidence for brain involvement or neuronal infiltration by the virus, there's actually been very little sort of clinical studies to actually back that up. And there have been sort of a handful of studies which have shown potentially a virus in the CSF, but less so actually directly invading the brain. But increasingly we're seeing studies reporting antibodies to the virus as well. So there's quite a few ways in which it can affect the brain. But the direct sort of invasion of the brain, which was also feared on the basis of the sort of striking feature of the anosmia and lack of taste, which many of us have experienced as part of having had COVID. So, I think there was a direct, concern that might be a route in through the olfactory bulbs, but that's become less of a sort of where the money is on the basis of it really being nailed that it's slightly more an epithelial damage rather than direct invasion of olfactory bulbs.
And as you said, it's once it reaches the brain, it's when all the trouble starts. And there are several papers nowadays, like the one from the Alba COVID registry published in Neurology this August, but also yours with the Coroner Study Group in June, published in the Lancet Psychiatry, reporting that a significant proportion of people hospitalized with COVID-19 had some sort of neurological symptoms. So, these were pretty diverse, ranging from headaches, to movement disorders. So what does the virus do to the brain? Do we know?
No, I think the Coroner study was a very important one. This was led by Ben Michael Tom Solomon, Rhys Thomas, and some others at Liverpool and other universities in the UK. So this was a UK surveillance study. So although it gives us an indication of the spread of clinical syndromes, it doesn't give us any idea about the prevalence, because it really just relies on clinicians reporting. So we get a rough idea by the proportion of stuff that clinicians are noticing and reporting. But this was a brilliant study because it was sort of a dormant study waiting, that had funding ready to go on the basis of other pandemics. So you've got sort of ethics to get up and going quickly to report data on clinical syndromes clinicians are experiencing. And we extended that into psychiatry and neuropsychiatry, because on the basis of the previous pandemics of many viruses, we know that the neuropsychiatry is at least as, is a potentially big issue. And that was what we found really in this study, that neuropsychiatric complications are pretty commonly reported, and therefore possibly something reasonably common as a clinical entity that people are seeing on the ground. But the real the two main take homes from that paper were that a stroke is very common, commonly reported, and subsequent studies have backed that up, that it's perhaps about 2% of inpatients with COVID might have a stroke, and this is largely thought to be sort of vascularly mediated problem triggered by the virus, but also in younger patients, perhaps, so delirium in older patients, and potentially a mixed bag of other complex psychiatric presentations in younger patients, which is very much a relevant working in neuropsychiatry and liaison psychiatry.
I mean, interestingly, in one of the earlier papers, it was published in JAMA. So Lingmao and her team looked into the neurological manifestations of hospitalized patients with COVID-19 in Wuhan, where it all started. But what I found extremely interesting was that, for some patients, neurological were the only symptom they displayed. No fever, no cough, so nothing that could remotely resemble a typical COVID-19 patient. So how is that possible?
Well, I think it's fascinating, and I think it's partly due to the extreme heterogeneity and the individual effects of this virus on different individuals. We all notice that from our friends and colleagues who we may know have had COVID. We also know it from our clinical work if we work in the field as well. But it could equally be gastro-dermatological effects as well. So lots of different systems are picked off in different people, and the classical systemic severe sort of feelings of general malaise, fever, and respiratory symptoms are just one, probably the most common form and the most dangerous form, at least, for the majority of people. But, we all know of people who've had COVID toe potentially, so this strange sort of vasculitis of the toes, leading to pain and sometimes visible changes in the toes. It can be GI upset initially, and that might be all someone gets. And also, the younger you get, the more likely you are to have one of these more specific subtypes, rather than, if you're more elderly, you tend to have a more cognitive respiratory component as well, and that's obviously what you'll notice. So it's just and I think we're seeing on a scale of millions of people affected, so we're able to see all these subtypes come out, but in viral effects, in viruses affecting smaller numbers of people, we wouldn't necessarily be able to notice.
I mean, on a similar note, in a June paper by Omer Karadas at Neurological Sciences, I note that certain blood markers were significantly raised in people with COVID-19 and neurological symptoms compared to ones that didn't develop any neurological manifestations. So is that currently, let's say, a way to predict which of our patients will have neurological consequences?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are very early studies giving an indication of what potentially we might find as a predictor, or at least an idea into the mechanism. And very large studies are now being planned. There's a massive study that Ben Michael and Jerome Breen here at King's, so Ben's in Liverpool, to look into the mechanisms of these disorders and try and work that out. There's also a community sampling version of that using the UK bioresource that will hopefully start to give us some answers. But there are some interesting signals coming out from these early studies, but they're all, you need these large, ideally prospective and well-controlled studies to really get a handle on this. But I think this will definitely be something we will do, and it's a massive research priority to get this sorted out, urgently, rather than waiting the normal year or two you have to get this sort of data in.
Fair enough. So it sounds like it's pretty still unclear. You've recently co-authored the editorial for JNNP that attempted to answer the question of whether there is a causal link between the virus and neurological complications in patients with COVID-19. Essentially, is there, or is it just a coincidence?
Yeah, and I think this is a critical point, and I think it's something we all need to bear in mind as researchers in the field, and also I think for clinicians, because the temptation is to see a neurological complication in someone who's COVID positive and assume there must be a causal link. And this paper really is just to flag up the Bradford Hill criteria, so this sort of classical criteria for establishing or at least increasing your certainty of causality rather than just association. And obviously there are sort of 8 or 9, depending how you look at it, criteria, and from strength of association, some of the most convincing things will be the temporal association, so the type, timing connection between one event and another, but there's a whole bunch of other ones, and particularly I think mechanistic sort of studies or mechanistic, a sort of biological plausibility to a connection. And I think a great example of this tension is perhaps with Guillain-Barré syndrome, there's been a lot of case reports of Guillain-Barré syndrome associated COVID, but it can just happen spontaneously in people, full stop. But there's a priori reasons to believe that an autoimmune response can be triggered by viruses in general, but also potentially coronaviruses such as SARS-CoV-2. So I think we've got sort of an interesting thing, and what we really need to see is an increased signal. So are we going to see increased rates of Guillain-Barré? And the preliminary data is that there isn't a massive signal. So even though we're seeing case reports, is it just us as clinicians getting very, sort of instantly making connections between clinical events that may or may not be causally related? So I think it's a sort of salient reminder to be cautious in our interpretation of causality.
And then, of course, it's the psychiatric symptoms. Now, no matter how much we want to feel special, the truth is that this is not the first coronavirus outbreak that the world had to face. But back in May, Jonathan Rogers published a paper in the Lancet Psychiatric looking into the neuropsychiatric consequences of previous coronavirus outbreaks. It does correlate with what we see in this pandemic, right?
Yeah, I think the headline features are the same, and I think soon we might start to overtake the knowledge, because obviously SARS and MERS were less of a clinical catastrophe for the world, so there was less studies of it and less numbers to study, obviously. But some of the headlines from Jonathan's great and Ed Chesney and others, Tom Pollack and others, Tony David, this meta-analysis were that the things that stood out were delirium, cognitive impairment, and obviously this is something we're seeing a lot, both with acute and less subacute sort of patients, but also fatigue being a prominent chronic problem. And then moving into the sort of more pure psychiatry, PTSD rates were pretty high, as were depression and anxiety as well. So I think we need to keep our minds open for the same full spectrum of neuropsychiatric to psychiatric complications, which can have a range of different mechanisms involved, from biological mechanisms to more stress-related mechanisms associated with the pandemic. So essentially we're seeing the same things, but I think our knowledge will soon start to overtake what we've got about SARS and MERS due to the massive investment that we're seeing in studies, but also the numbers we've got to study of this.
I mean, on a similar note, you just mentioned that a bit. So the psychiatric consequences to SARS-CoV-2 infection can be caused both by the immune response to the virus itself or by psychological stressors such as isolation, the psychological impact of a pandemic, among other things. So how easy would it be to differentiate that? And in the end of the day, does it matter to do so?
Yeah, I mean, simple answer to that is it's very hard to differentiate it, and it does matter. So I think there's a huge amount of work to be done in working this out, and it does matter because it does affect how we conceptualize and treat these disorders, how we manage them. Obviously, we can't do anything much about the stress that people are under, but we can certainly sort of help identify it and to some degree ameliorate it. But that's more of a sort of socio-political problem than it is a sort of such a direct medical. I mean, we need to keep an eye out for the consequences of it, but we can't do so much to sort of improve it necessarily. But I think it's fascinating and it is important, and we really need studies to unpick that. And I think also there's a transition potentially from, there's a mix. It's not one or the other. It can be a blend, and there can also be a transition from sort of a biological to a more psychological component as well that can happen in a given individual. So I think these are really interesting questions that we don't really know. So we have to be scientifically modest and admit that we don't fully know, but we massively need to address this, and it's fascinating.
Now, the experience from previous outbreaks suggests that patients, did manage to resume normality, including going back to work. Now, findings from the current pandemic suggest that the majority of patients will recover in something like 2 weeks. Now, in a preprint from the COVID symptom study, of those who develop COVID, about 1 in 7 will be ill for at least 4 weeks, 1 in 20 for 8 weeks, and a further 2% of cases will persist for 12 weeks or more. And in fact, in your recent editorial for the BMJ, you dedicated nearly 1/3 of the available space to something called Longcovet. So can you tell us a bit more?
Yes, so this is, I think many people will have heard of this and probably know quite a lot about it, because it's appropriately getting a lot of press attention. So this is really, it's still not been fairly officially defined. NIHR and NICE have developed a sort of interim diagnostic criteria, but they're fairly sort of light on detail about how, apart from that it needs to be sort of 3 months of symptoms to be diagnosed. But I think it's a fascinating issue, and it's really at the forefront of patient-led research, because patient groups coalesced and started to, particularly on the sort of app Slack, sort of work groups, and started to report that they had very severe chronic symptoms, despite what was originally quite a relatively mild disorder. And that's not mild in any sort of flippant sense. It's the fact that they weren't hospitalized. So people who didn't need to go into hospital with low oxygen or other acute complications, but sort of had a sort of moderate level illness initially, but then were left with very chronic severe symptoms. And we're just starting to get a feel for exactly what this is. And the patient-led data has been fascinating. It's shown that cardiorespiratory symptoms are very common, but increasingly neurological symptoms and neuropsychiatric symptoms are very common as well. So particularly fatigue, headache, memory problems, brain fog. So very disabling symptoms that people are left with many months down the line. And we're starting to see people coming up to 9 to 12, well, 9 months of chronic symptoms now. And I think we'll also see a second wave potentially of such patients as well, as we see those in Europe, this second wave coming through. So it's a fascinating condition, and I think it's also one of the big things has been to get clinicians to take this seriously as a real problem. A lot of people have felt very dismissed, and probably were, as being depressed or anxious, and these aren't real symptoms, but they're obviously very real symptoms that are very severe and impairing. So we need to try and work out urgently what's going on, because there's potentially a very big wave of patients coming through primary and then secondary care with this.
And Tim, many people have made links of, long COVID with clinical entities like chronic fatigue syndrome. So what's your opinion on that?
I think there are definitely some similarities, and it's very early days to start making any direct comparisons with different clinical syndromes. But I think we urgently need to study this, and we're already starting to hopefully use the coroner study to augment the amazing patient-led research and actually get clinician-reported data. We need cohort studies. There was a big £20 million call from NIHR just a few days ago to urgently research this problem, and it's got very high traction with politicians and healthcare and researcher and funding bodies as well. So we need to really get to grips with it straight away and try to understand what's going on.
I mean, one thing that this virus did, among all the other things, is that it exposed the massive health inequalities perpetuated by capitalist societies all around the world. Papers in The Lancet, in the JAMA, they painted a grim picture of minorities being hit way harder and actually die in greater numbers. And then even recently, a JNNP paper highlighted that Asian ethnicity strongly linked to COVID-related stroke. So do you see similar impacts on the neuropsychiatric complications in your studies?
Yes, there's definitely some differences, some ethnic differences in vulnerability, and I think certainly within the sort of more pure psychiatry, we would expect to see socioeconomic problems being a massive predictor as well. It's going to be slightly less clear whether that will be the case for the more sort of neuropsychiatric, neurological complications, and potentially we'll see that as well. But I suspect there'll be a sort of gradient of risk both in terms of socioeconomic and demographic. And of course, we would expect that to be the case. I mean, we've had the clue from what we've been discussing. This is a very heterogeneous disorder, and how it affects one person or another is highly variable, even within the same ethnicity. So we see these massive effects, and by age and other factors. So there's going to be a huge number of biological risk factors that we'll be unpicking, and these studies we've got coming online will start to hopefully give us some insight to. But I think where it's particularly important is when there's, it feels when there's a sort of socio-economic political component to this. So this is something we can address and fix quicker, and it's something that perhaps highlights the woeful discrepancies in our healthcare system sometimes.
In the first ever Braincast back in 1996, okay, it was just this April, I remember I asked Dr. Tom Pollack the following, that Michael Benrose from Denmark, he published a paper back in 2011 using population-based research in Denmark, looking into autoimmune diseases and severe infections as risk factors for schizophrenia. Now, it is interesting to know, though, that they hint that the results may be related to immunological reactivation of less severe infections acquired earlier in life, or be the result of a maternal infection that could permanently alter the peripheral immune system of the fetus. So what does this mean about pregnant women during this pandemic? Should they be worried?
Well, I think on the basis of firm evidence, I think not. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to pontificate about, because it's be exceptionally distressing to worry about that if pregnant in this current climate. There's enough socioeconomic hardship to deal with, but I think it's a theoretical issue that we need to investigate. And certainly Tom and Esther Coutinho here, who's done a lot of work in looking for neurodevelopmental changes caused by antibodies in that exact situation. So I think at the moment we don't have any strong evidence that that's the case, but it's certainly something we've got this. I think we need to collect samples now and study this, because again, we've got this naturalistic experiment going on and huge numbers where we can start to get a bit of a handle on this, is what is theoretically quite a big potential risk. So we shouldn't start to worry people, but it's certainly an opportunity to research and get some proper data on this and see whether this is a real issue.
Now, you were one of the key people of creating a massively influential and important resource, even from the early days of COVID, alongside Matt Butler and Tom Pollack at the Journal of Neurology, Neurosurgery and Psychiatry. But you didn't stop there, though, and you were one of the main people behind the national COVID CNS team that was recently awarded £2.8 million to study the underlying biology of COVID driving brain complications. So can you give us a taste of, what are you aspiring to find, but most importantly, how?
Yes, so this is a study, as I briefly mentioned earlier on, led by Jerome Bream here at King's and Ben Michael in Liverpool, but it's a massive national study, originally 13 studies across the UK, all nations of the UK, but now increasing to sort of beyond 15, 16 centres. So this is a sort of a great initiative, but not just because of the national nature of it, but the cross-disciplinary nature of it. So it's neurologists and psychiatrists and psychologists coming together to study these really complex things that we've just been highlighting. So it's got two sort of parts to it. There's a big study of inpatients who've developed complications across the spectrum of neurology and neuropsychiatry. And then there's also a community sampling where they'll be looking at the national bioresource, which is a sort of many thousands of patients who are already recruited, where they've got genetics and samples and clinical data on, and looking at those who've had COVID and those who haven't, to try and answer a lot of these questions we've been discussing. So this is great. But the blog team is also brilliant. There's again, that's a massively increasing team of fantastic trainees and across clinical neurosciences and some medical students. And we're always looking for more people to join the team. It feels a bit like one of the Wallace and Gromit films, where he's putting train track out in front of himself on his train, trying to keep the train on the tracks with our blog, because we have more and more work to do as the number of papers we find each week. So this is really a great resource if people want to learn about these emerging systems, because we also knew that the standard systematic review wouldn't be quick enough. It takes 3-4 months for something to come out, and we want to have this week's news. We want to have everything rapidly synthesized. So we're also developing a living systematic review, a meta-analysis of the prevalence of these complications, which Ali Rooney in Edinburgh is working on, and hopefully we're just wrapping up the analysis of that, or doing the analysis this week, so hopefully that'll be out in the next next month or so. We plan to repeat that every 6 months, or hopefully more frequently if we have the resources, to try and give us some answers to this. So it's at the cutting edge of the information sort of revolution about how we deal with scientific information. We haven't got time to wait for 6 months or for things to be out of date as soon as they're published. We need information immediately.
And Tim, we're heading towards one of the biggest financial recessions of all time, with many of our fellow citizens undergoing extreme financial difficulties to the point of survival. And, someone could cringe at the fact that NIHR just announced a £20 million grant. There's another 2.8 million grants. But what would you say to people that cringe to these numbers? Why is it important to keep research not only afloat, but as productive as possible during these times?
Well, I think the simple answer is that every pound invested in this will pay for itself manyfold back, not just in hopefully preventing these disorders, treating them better, but I think understanding long COVID is a particular example. That's it feels like a large amount of money, £20 million, and there's £10 million for clinical services into long COVID, which I think the latter will probably only scratch the surface of what's required. That won't go far nationally at all in terms of a clinical service. What we think is many thousands of patients, possibly even tens, if not maybe even hundreds of thousands of patients over the next few years. So I think that, you can think about the time, just thinking coldly, even if you're not thinking about patients themselves, just thinking about the health economics of people being off work and not contributing to, and needing care, health and social care. So I think it's a no-brainer, quite literally, in terms of investing in this problem.
And concluding, given that existing and emerging evidence suggests a clear neuropsychiatric footprint for COVID, what would you recommend to frontline clinicians?
Well, I think there's a couple of take-home points at the moment. I think one of the most obvious ones is keeping an eye out for delirium. Delirium is a very common can even be a sign of COVID before anything else is manifested in the elderly. So for those working in care homes and old age psychiatry or old age general medicine, then I think that's a critical thing. So screening and being alert for delirium and thinking of that as a cue for COVID. I think beyond that, keeping a close eye out for the complications that we're starting to see. So in the short term, strokes, paralysis, and I think the long-term fatigue, brain fog, and trying to work out clinically what's going on, and then be informed by the science that hopefully won't be far behind in terms of working this out. I think the other big thing is the increasing use of steroids, and we're probably going to see quite a lot of neuropsychiatric direct complications of steroid use, whether it's mania and the wide, and we know mania and psychotic mania is going to be a big issue, but steroids can do most things to the brain psychiatrically, so we need to keep a bit of an eye out for that. And I'm sure in your work you've probably seen a fair bit of that already.
I am at the receiving end. BRAINCAST people, this is Dr. Tim Nicholson. If you can't get enough of him, just visit his team's blog, where, trust me, you can spend months reading all about COVID and the brain. Next week, we stay microscopic, scientific, and ultra-futuristic as we catch a glimpse of what the future of neurology and psychiatry may hold. How can a dish help us understand our brain better? Enter the world of induced pluripotent stem cells and brain organoids. Yes, you can grow a brain on a dish, you bet you can. With me, a pioneer of neuroscience, none other than Professor Jack Price, Professor of Developmental Neurobiology. Until then, Pospo and BRAINCAST for Mostly Learning, over and out.